Good morning, and welcome to today's episode of The Lens of Identity, exploring privilege, race, and disability, where we dive deep into the complexities of social identity and the structures that shape our world. My name is Zoe, and today we're going to explore how our social identities intersect with systems of privilege and discrimination, with a particular focus on my own experiences as someone with both a dominant and subordinate identity. Now, I am aware that all of us carry multiple social identities, some dominant, some subordinate, and some that fall somewhere in between. We may belong to different racial, ethnic, gender, or ability groups, and each of those identities play a role in shaping how we experience the world. In this episode, I'm going to focus on two identities that I hold: my dominant identity as an able-bodied person and my subordinate identity as someone with Mexican and Filipino heritage. These identities are constantly interacting with structures and institutions, and I want to explore how they impact my daily life and how they intersect with larger social systems. Starting off, let's talk about my dominant identity, being able-bodied. This identity often feels invisible to me because, well, it's something I've never really had to think about. The world is designed for people like me, whether it's public spaces, schools, or even the workplace. I don't have to navigate through physical or societal barriers related to my body's ability. This reality is something I've only truly started to reflect on after learning more about how people with disabilities experience the world. As an able-bodied person, I am spared the microaggressions and biases that disabled individuals often face. For example, a great article by Migdal featured on The Mighty discusses common microaggressions like, "You don't look disabled," which is often said to people with invisible disabilities. I've never had to worry about such comments, and I can't imagine how frustrating and invalidating people with disabilities must feel. For me, my identity as an able-bodied person means that I can move through the world without extra barriers. But for so many others, just existing in the world involves constant challenges. However, my dominant identity also plays a role in how I interact with broader societal structures, and these systems benefit me in ways I didn't realize. For instance, when we think about policing, it's clear that disabled people, especially those who are Black and Indigenous, face disproportionate violence and mistreatment. According to a report from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, over half of the police killings in the U.S. go unreported, and Black Americans are at a greater risk of fatal violence. As an able-bodied person, I've never had to worry that my physical or mental state would escalate a police encounter, whereas a disabled individual may be heightened risk for misunderstanding or harm. I have learned that while PTSD may not be a visible disability, its effects can be deeply profound, and these mental health struggles are often overlooked. Murphy's piece made me realize that I have never experienced the barriers associated with a physical disability, and people who are able-bodied benefit from the societal tendency to overlook and minimize mental health issues. As someone without disabilities, I've never been judged for needing time off or taking medication to manage mental health, which is unfortunately a common challenge for many disabled individuals. And it doesn't stop with policing. In the mass incarceration system, Dwayne explains how jails often become death traps for disabled individuals who may not receive necessary medical care or accommodations. This is another example of how being able-bodied shields people from certain systematic failures that disproportionately harm people with disabilities. Similarly, in the healthcare system, Carr talks about how mental health care is political, and while it is a challenging space for everyone, I often have an easier time accessing care. While disabled individuals, however, are often left out of conversations around healthcare rights and face systematic neglect. I've never been denied care simply because of my body's needs or because of biases towards my ability. Finally, in terms of marriage, it's assumed that all individuals can get married and that relationship status reflects personal worth. However, Edward highlights how society often views disabled people as less deserving of partnerships, or they face barriers to creating families. I've never been in a position to ever have to confront these barriers, but it's important to acknowledge how these societal structures favor able-bodied individuals. Now let's shift focus and talk about my subordinate identity, being Mexican and Filipino. As someone who carries both Mexican and Filipino heritage, I've experienced the complexities of racial identity in the US, where both pride and challenges coexist. While I carry immense pride in my culture, I've also encountered racism and stereotypes throughout my life. For example, I've been misidentified as other races. They claim that I am not Mexican or Filipino, or people have also made assumptions about my intelligence or work ethic based solely on my ethnicity. One powerful source that resonates with my experience is Stop AAPI Hate. AAPI is an abbreviation for Asian American Pacific Islander. The data from this report shows that anti-Asian hate crimes rose dramatically during the COVID-19 pandemic, affecting not just Chinese communities but also Filipino communities. The fear of becoming a target simply based on someone's ethnic background is realistically accurate for many in the Asian American community, including myself. This kind of hate leaves a mental scar, as you're constantly questioning your safety in spaces that should feel welcoming. Additionally, Garcia highlights the rise of white Latino racism, a phenomenon that's all too real for many Latino communities. While I am proud to be Mexican and Filipino, there's an ongoing struggle within our community, particularly regarding colorism and the privilege of whiter Latinos. This division reflects deeper Eurocentric values that marginalize darker skinned individuals, a problem I have seen in my own family and community. Growing up in a lower income household, my family often struggled to access what we needed due to the cost. We didn't always have the money to afford the resources or health insurance, and when we did seek help, there was often a sense of being overlooked or not taken seriously, especially when it came to addressing cultural barriers. Colada highlights how race and class intersect in the healthcare system, a reality that significantly affects communities like mine. She discusses how people of color, especially those from working class backgrounds, face disparities in healthcare access and treatment. Her research points out that these systemic inequities are not just about individual circumstances. They are deeply embedded in the structure of healthcare itself, disadvantaging communities of color on a larger scale. Now, let's consider how these racial dynamics impact broader systems, such as housing. The National Low Income Housing Coalition reports that communities of color, especially Black and Latino communities, face severe shortages of affordable housing. As someone from a working class background, I've witnessed how hard it is for families like mine to access stable housing. This is a perfect example of how structural inequality and racism intersect in tangible ways, denying communities of color access to basic human needs. Another thought, the child welfare system disproportionately targets low income and families of color. Joyce writes about how parenting while poor is criminalized, particularly for communities of color. And Mexican and Filipino families are not exempt from this. In my own experience, I've seen how cultural misunderstandings can result in interventions by child welfare systems, putting vulnerable families at risk simply because of their socioeconomic status and race. Finally, we look at education, where Badia, Miller, and Kotz show how Ivy League institutions and other elite colleges are disproportionately accessible to wealthy, predominantly white families. For people of color, the pressure to navigate higher education while facing systemic barriers like financial constraints, cultural biases, and lack of representation has been a constant struggle. It has been both illuminating and humble to examine the points where my dominant and subordinate identities intersect. I'm aware of my privilege in navigating a world that has been created for people like me because I am able bodied. Until I take the time to listen to experiences of individuals with disabilities, such as those described in Collada's and Murphy's writings. This privilege is frequently invisible. These accounts highlight the extent of the difficulties marginalized populations endure in sectors such as healthcare, law enforcement, and marriage, difficulties that I've never directly experienced. However, because of my Mexican and Filipino ancestry, I am situated inside systems that frequently exclude people of color. Colada's observations regarding healthcare inequality strike a deep chord. My family's difficulties gaining access and being represented in medical settings are a component of a larger systemic problem. In a similar vein, the difficulties in child welfare, education, and housing demonstrate how institutions still support inequality for communities of color. Being privileged in certain contexts and while being excluded in others serves as a reminder to me that identity is multifaceted and dynamic. It also emphasizes how critical it is to confront systemic injustices within institutions that influence many people's lived experiences rather than as discrete problems. In order to confront and alter these systems for a more fair future, advocacy and action must come after reflection. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope this conversation sparks some reflection in your own experiences and societal structures that shape them. Until next time, take care and try making a change in the world so we can work together to create a more inclusive society.